Like I mentioned previously, welcome to episode number 4 on citations and polishing. Before we jump into the nitty-gritty of our presentation today, I did want to share some of the things we're going to be covering. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at strategies to create citations and a reference list. We're also going to be looking at methods to revise your writing and some resources to aid you in finishing up the touches before you submit your final draft. So I am going to transition over to Karina now, and she is going to jump into the presentation.
Hey everyone. So in episodes 1 and 2 of our 4-part series, we talked about keeping track of your resources as you searched for and read through your sources and took notes about what you were reading and what you liked and what you didn't like. Today, we'll be talking in more detail about citations and what needs to be done as you finalize your first draft. So, first things first. It's important to know what citations are. And so, generally speaking, a citation indicates to the people that are reading your work that certain things in your paper, whether they be arguments or quotes or ideas, originated from someone else's work. Now, together, your in-text citations and your full reference list at the end of your paper show the readers how you built your argument and how you are supporting the facts that you're stating in your paper. And we'll talk a little bit more about the different citations, so the in-text citations and the reference list, a little bit later in the presentation. So, why is it important to cite? Well, as a student, you are part of an academic community. You are a scholar. And so citing is incredibly important because it shows support for your ideas. It also prevents you from plagiarizing, which is incredibly important. I cannot stress that enough. In the academic community, plagiarizing is a really serious offense, and in many cases, it can result in expulsion. So you definitely don't want to plagiarize. And last but not least, it's important to cite because it just ensures the accuracy of scholarly knowledge. One of the things that we always tell students is that if you find the perfect article for your paper, check out the reference list because that's what that particular author used to substantiate the claims in their paper. And so some of those articles in the result list or in the reference list could also be useful for your needs as well. And so it's the same with your paper. You're showing people how you found your knowledge, and you're giving them sort of a breadcrumb trail to follow if they wanted to learn more about the topic. So now we should consider when to cite sources. Now, generally speaking, citing is imperative for anything that is not common knowledge. And this really speaks to the audience that you're writing for. So for a scholar at the graduate level in psychology, and if they're writing for other graduate level students in that field, they might not have to cite something about Sigmund Freud, something that he's well known for in the field, because everybody in the class, in that community, have that understanding of Freud and his theories. If that same student was writing for high school students or for undergrad students who don't have as much background knowledge of Freud and the theory of psychology or whatnot, they should definitely cite their sources so that people know that it is factual and that there's evidence saying that it's true. Now, one thing to note is that it can be a little gray area, right? Because you might not be sure what audience you're writing for. If you are ever in doubt about whether or not you should cite, just cite it. It's always better to err on the side of caution. Now, going back to that last slide where we said that you should cite anything that is not common knowledge, let's talk about what common knowledge is. And common knowledge is basically information that is widely accepted as truth. The average reader would not need to look it up. And so again, that speaks to the audience that I had just discussed for the average psychology graduate student. They won't need the background information about Freud because they've already really learned about it and know that it is true. So always think about your audience and think about what is or is not common knowledge. Now we have a fun little kind of breakout quiz for you, flash quiz we can call it, and we're going to give you a bunch of different statements and tell us yes or no whether or not you think it is common knowledge. So the first statement, tell me if this is common knowledge. Answer yes or no. There are 7 days in a week.
Ooh.
And you should have a poll. Great, Eli and Ryan.
So we're checking number 1.
Great, so yes, most people will know, right? If they're not in elementary school, we'll say that there are 7 days in a week. So we can say that that's common knowledge and we wouldn't have to cite that in our paper. Moving on to our next statement. Hawaii is the 50th state in the United States of America. Is that common knowledge? I got a yes from Eli. Yes from Ryan. Great. So for the most part, I'd say that definitely that statement is common knowledge. When I've previously talked about this with other students, they've said, no, like someone in, let's say, Germany might not know that Hawaii is the 50th state in the United States of America. And so you'll want to think about your audience. Are you writing for people primarily in the US or elsewhere? And then cite it appropriately based on that. Moving on to our next statement. The phrase Big Bang was coined by Sir Fred Hoyle, an English astronomer. Eli says no, that is not common knowledge, as does Kim. Great, so I don't think that this is common knowledge, but that's because I didn't study astronomy. And so for someone with that background, they might say that it is common knowledge and not cite it. But that would be at a very specialized level. And so if I were saying this in my paper, I would definitely cite my source. Now moving on to our next one, pollution is bad for the environment. Do you think that's common knowledge? Kim, Ryan, Eli, I think it is too. The reasons that you state that it's bad for the environment would probably need to be cited though, right? Yeah. Next one, the first international coffee syndicate was based in Germany. I agree with all of you. I do not think that's common knowledge, but people in Germany might think that's common knowledge. And so always think about your audience. I would definitely cite my source if I was using that in a paper though. George Washington, was he the first president? Is that common knowledge? Awesome. And then French is the primary language in France. Great. So I think you guys all have a really good understanding of what common knowledge is. So just think about things when you're writing your paper. If it doesn't seem like people would know that it's common knowledge, to definitely cite it. Now let's move on to the different facets of the citations that you should be using in your papers. Now there are two factors to consider. The first are in-text citations, and there's different ways to weave your citations into the text. You can paraphrase, which is basically saying the same thing in different words. You can use a direct quote from the paper or the book, or you can summarize it, which is basically taking a large idea and boiling it down to 1 or 2 sentences. The second part is your full reference list. And so that has the majority of the information that anyone would need to find the full text of that paper or that book. And typically in our reference list, right, we have the author's last name, first initial, the title, if it was a journal article, the name of the journal, if it was a book, the name of the publisher, what year it was published, all those good stuff. One important thing to note is that all of your in-text citations need to point to a reference in your reference list and vice versa. There have been many papers that I've seen where that doesn't happen. And it's important to know that when you're building your in-text citations, it's telling someone that that is something that they can locate at the end of your paper and that they could read if they wanted to based on the information that you're giving to them. So always remember to make sure that your in-text citations point to a full reference and that it points, all your references in the reference list point to something in your paper. Now, Eli has a question. How do you cite multiple authors once you have cited all their names? I guess I'm asking how to abbreviate. That's a great question, Eli. Once I show you the guide that we're about to dive into, that may help you to further identify the solution to your problem. But that would definitely depend on the citation style that you're using. So do you know what citation style you need to use? APA. Okay, great. We'll actually take a look at that. So if everybody could go to this website, guides.westoahu.hawaii.edu/citing. I'm going to pull it up right over here. Bookmark it if you can, or save it somewhere. This guide was designed to serve as a jumping off point for you. And so the main page just has the information that we just talked about, what citations are, why you should say it, when you should say it, examples of what is common knowledge. And then we have the main citation styles that you can access up here or over here. And so if I was interested in more information about APA, I would obviously click on that tab and a bunch of information would pop up. On the left, we have useful links. So to Purdue OWL, which is a great resource, and to the official manual. If the library has it, it would be here in that section. And then you could find out more information about it and how to find it in the library so that you could consult it. In this box over here, there's a bunch of information, as you can see. The first tab is just basic information. So if there's a preferred font type and size, that would be there. Information about the margins that are required of you or spacing. All of that would be on this tab. For your in-text citations, you would click here and you would find concrete examples of how to paraphrase or quote or summarize for your paper. And so there's different ways of doing that. And so for example, if we were using a quote, you'll notice that you can incorporate some of the elements that are in the full in-text citation into the actual text. So here I have the author's last name, the year that it was published, and the page number that I pulled the quote from. That's because I didn't incorporate any of that information into the text. But in this example, I did. And so you'll notice how it looks different. It's always good to use variety when you're writing. It just shows a little more fluidity and, I guess, versatility. And so try to incorporate as many of these examples into your text as possible. For in-text citations, if you scroll down a little more, there will also be information about how to cite multiple authors. And so for APA in particular, it's important to know that with 3 to 5 authors, the first in-text citation includes all of their last names. Every subsequent in-text citation kind of condenses it. So the first author's name et al. So is that clear to everyone? And then if it's 6 or more, I feel sorry for the other 5, but it's only the first author's name. So useful information under the in-text citations tab. And then if we go to the next tab, this is how you build your reference list. And so important information about capitalization, order, of course, alphabetical, again, with information about the authors. And you'll notice that it's a little different, right, from the in-text citations. And so you'll want to go to the appropriate tab based on what you're doing. And then the last two tabs just give clear examples if you were trying to cite a print book or an ebook or a book chapter or a journal article that has a digital object identifier, or if it does not have one. And if you have any questions about that, you can look it up on your own, just click on that, and it'll give you more information about what a DOI is. So Eli, are you confident with citing multiple authors? Awesome. So I hope that you guys find this guide useful. All of the citation styles are slightly different, so it's important to consult the manual for the style that you are required to use, and to take pride in the citations that you're doing. One thing that I do want to mention is that in the research episode of this series, we did highlight a lot of the features on the databases, one of which is the automatic citation generator. It's always important to double check what they come up with because they are known to make mistakes. For me, I'd say they have about a 50% success rate. So it's important, again, to just double check that they're doing it right because you don't want to take them at face value and then get dinged by your professor because something's wrong. So if there are no further questions, I am going to turn over the presentation to Robin. Thank you, guys.
Okay. Okay, so we're gonna jump into the revisions and editing portion of this workshop. And so to start off, I want to talk a little bit about the differences between revisions and editing. And different professors or different people might have different definitions of these, but I think the important thing to remember is thinking about revisions and editing along, I guess, along a continuum, and thinking about going through this process from revisions, which are usually larger scale changes, moving bigger pieces of your writing around, to the editing, which is usually smaller scale, starting to look at words, word choice, punctuations, and those smaller things. So this slide kind of talks about the differences and some important pieces of the definitions for revisions and editing. So we talked a little bit about how revisions are larger scale, editing is smaller scale. Revisions, I think, so again, everyone might do this a little bit differently, but for me, I do revisions, I start doing revisions before I'm even really done drafting. So I would say I'm pretty much revising ideally at least a month, the whole time that I'm writing. Whereas the editing, I would say I really do more in the final stages only, when I have a real solid draft. The other thing that I think is really helpful to remember about revision is to look at breaking down the word and the root words and the prefix and that kind of thing. So so if we break it down, right, we see the word vision in there. So if you can think of revision as literally re-seeing, to kind of try and see your draft differently and see it through another person's eyes, or kind of change how you're looking at it and what might make it better. I think that's a really helpful way to think about revision. And we'll talk about proofreading and editing a little bit more as well, but just to kind of, know that up front, that proofreading is part of editing as well. Okay, let's see. Okay, so this slide, or this image, this is something that Karina found that is really helpful to think about and remember the differences between revision and editing. So up at the top, you can see they talk about revise. They use the acronym ARMS, right? Versus editing uses the acronym CUPS. So we think about ARMS, we use something to carry something big, right? If you're using your arms to carry something, you're carrying something big, versus if you're using a cup to carry something, you're carrying something small. So that can help us to remember the difference between revising and editing. And then in these boxes, it talks about You know, what are some of the things that you're concerned with when you're working on revision or when you're working on editing? So when you're in revision, you might be adding. This talks about sentences or words, but I think it can be even bigger than that. It could be adding whole paragraphs, adding whole sources. Talks about removing. So again, whether that's at the level of words and sentences or paragraphs or sources or conclusions or introductions. Moving. So again, moving, you know, whether it's sentences and words or paragraphs, and then substituting. So trying out different things, trying out a new introduction or whatever. Trying on a new strategy for your conclusion. Editing it spells out cups. It gives us some ideas of the smaller things we might be focused on when we get to the editing stage. So there's capitalization, usage, making sure we're using the right words, the best words for what we're trying to say, punctuation, and spelling. Okay, so that's just to kind of help us remember those differences. Some kind of general tips to keep in mind when we're thinking about revising and editing. So like I said, one of the big tricks with these is to kind of force yourself to see your writing in a different way. I think a lot of times we work so hard on our writing, and it's really important and valuable and personal to us. But sometimes we need to be a little bit tough with ourselves and force ourselves to, you know, to make a change, to make a difficult change in our writing, but it's really going to make our writing better. So a lot of these tips on this slide are about getting yourself, kind of like tricking yourself to see your writing with new eyes. So one way is to work with a hard copy. I think I've had this experience. I think a lot of people have had this experience where you read something over and over on the computer, and then as soon as you print it out, you find all kinds of mistakes and all kinds of things you want to change, right? So printing out a hard copy, somehow it's like this magic that lets you find things, find mistakes or whatever. Another strategy is to work with a friend. So again, your friend, or whether it's a tutor, a classmate, or whatever, they can probably see things differently than you do, right? You're the one who wrote it. It all makes sense to you, but you get someone else's perspective and they see things that you didn't see. Reading aloud. So this is another way to force yourself to see your writing differently, right? I think one thing is that it slows you down. So it slows you down, and you know that kind of forces you to see the words that are actually on the page instead of what you think is there in your head. Taking breaks. So again, just another way to see things differently. If you can take a break for a couple of days, that's great. You know, that's one of the benefits of not procrastinating, right? Is if you are able to actually take a day or a couple of days, then you can come back with a fresh set of eyes. We're going to talk about a few revision strategies now. Unfortunately, we don't have time to try all of these. We'll try out and practice one of the strategies, and the others are more for you to kind of, you know, just to kind of gather some strategies for yourself that hopefully you can practice in the future if they sound helpful to you. So one is cutting up the draft. So again, this is forcing us to see our draft in a different way. So you're going to print out a copy of your draft, and then you're going to cut it into paragraphs. You're going to mix up all your paragraphs, and then you're going to try to put them back in a different order, right? So this is not like a puzzle where you're trying to put it back how it was. The point is to try something different, right? Can this other paragraph work as an introduction? Can this other paragraph work as a conclusion? What happens if you mix up your body paragraphs? Which one works best first versus last? So of course, luckily we have word processing nowadays. So you have your original copy saved. So if you hate your new version, you can still go back to your old one. But this is a way to kind of experiment and see what are some other options and some other possibilities. You'll notice the word experiment. So that means it might not come out great. You might be like, this is a mess. I got to go back to how it was. You're totally allowed to do that. But, you know, try it out and see what happens. I used to make my students do this in like English 100 and stuff, and they were always super scared, but then sometimes they liked what they came up with at the end. Another strategy to try, another revision strategy, is reverse outlining. So a lot of times we're taught to outline before we write as a plan. For me personally, I like to do an outline after I do a draft. So it does mean that my draft is sometimes very messy. But I think no matter, even if you did make an outline already, I think it still can be helpful to reverse outline, especially if you have, the longer your drafts get, the more valuable I think reverse outlining is. So again, we're going to recommend you print out a copy of your draft. And then next to each paragraph, you're kind of putting like a label that identifies what is being discussed in that paragraph. So ideally, this is going to be a complete sentence, right? This might be like your topic sentence for that paragraph, your main point you're making in that paragraph. But if you're not quite there, just a label like this paragraph is about the benefits of GMOs. I don't know, just making things up. But so the idea is you have all these labels for each of your paragraphs, and then you can kind of look at those labels. It's kind of a way to get a quick overview of your paper. So rather than having to read it all through, you can look at this reverse outline, just look at what each paragraph is focusing on. And that can tell you, like, maybe you notice you have 2 paragraphs about the same topic. Maybe they should be next to each other. Maybe you realize this paragraph has nothing to do with your thesis. Maybe it should just be taken out completely. Or maybe you'll find that you have 2 paragraphs that are talking about the same thing, and maybe they should be combined. So there's a lot of different examples online. I did find this one kind of short, cute one, so I wanted to share this one. This is from the Amherst College Writing Center website. And so their thesis was Leonardo is the best Ninja Turtle. And their first supporting paragraph, so their second paragraph was he uses swords, which are cooler than the other turtles' weapons. So we can see this is their topic sentence, right, for paragraph 2. Probably within this paragraph, they talk about his swords and how cool they are and maybe how junk the other turtles' weapons are. Paragraph 3, their topic sentence is he always takes charge when the turtles get into trouble. So maybe they'll give some examples in this paragraph. Paragraph 4, April clearly likes him the best. So we could kind of argue over whether April liking him the best makes him the best Ninja Turtle. Maybe that might be one that we could, I don't know, we might want to change our language to make it clearer how that paragraph supports our thesis. We might decide that point is junk and we should make a new point. But anyway, this shows, how reverse outlining can help. The other thing that sometimes happens when you reverse outline is you look at a paragraph and you cannot even sum it up in one sentence. And so that tells you maybe this should be 2 separate paragraphs. So that's another thing. But there's so many examples of reverse outlines. Just if you look in Google, there's some really great examples that are about more complex topics that might be more helpful to you folks. But I recommend you kind of check those out if this sounds helpful to you. Okay, so this is the one we're gonna try out. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about the steps and then we're gonna practice. So, so we're gonna give you a passage to try this with. We're gonna pull it up on the screen. This one is called The Believing and Doubting Game. So the first step is you're gonna read through this passage as your strongest supporter. So if you imagine like maybe your nicest teacher you've ever had, or your best friend, or your mom, or whoever's very supportive of you. You're going to read through this passage and imagine you're that person, and you're going to put a plus sign next to the most convincing information, right? So the sentences or the parts of the paragraph where you're like, oh yeah, totally, like I totally agree with that. You're going to put your plus signs, okay? You know what? Let's jump to the passage and practice that. And then we'll come back to the steps after. So if you wanna, I'm gonna pull it up on the screen up here so we can all read it up there. If you do wanna bring it up on your own screen, this is the URL, bit.ly/UH-RaW4. But I'll pull it up right here as well. Let me make it a little bit bigger. Okay, so I am going to read through just the first paragraph, and we should be writing our plus signs next to the sentences or the parts that we are most convinced by. We put in sentence numbers too, so maybe if it's easier, since we're working on the screen, it might be easier to just write down the numbers of the sentences that you find most persuasive. Okay. Just when you think you have your finances all figured out for the semester, you get another bill for some obscure fee. Who is to blame? According to John Boehner and Howard McEwen in their article, Historical Perspectives on College Cost Increases, it is a combination of factors, including willingness by government leaders to continue to subsidize higher education regardless of whether institutions make responsible decisions. Where is this money going? Who is responsible for making the spending decisions? I attribute the outrageous cost to economic increases in building to keep up with competitive college marketing. Meanwhile, there are some non-traditional students that never step foot on campus, saving the college facility costs and do not benefit directly from the extra spending. It is a combination of students asking for more services and institutions vying for a mix of students. I agree with Boehner and McEwen that overspending is responsible for the college cost crisis because when institutions are not rewarded for sound economic standing, they have no incentive to provide an innovative educational experience that would uphold them to higher standards on doing more with less money. Okay, so keep your notes. We'll come back to that in a second. Let's look at our second step, okay? So we're gonna read through again, and this time we're gonna read through as a skeptic. So think of your toughest professor, maybe you have a friend that doesn't like any of your ideas, maybe you have a family member. So we're gonna read through again as a skeptic and mark all the parts where you're the most skeptical, okay? And then we'll talk about them after that. Okay, just when you think you have your finances all figured out for the semester, you get another bill for some obscure fee. Who is to blame? According to John Boehner and Howard McEwen in their article, Historical Perspectives on College Cost Increases, it is a combination of factors, including willingness by government leaders to continue to subsidize higher education, regardless of whether institutions make responsible decisions. Where is this money going? Who is responsible for making the spending decisions? I attribute the outrageous cost to economic increases in building to keep up with competitive college marketing. Meanwhile, there are some non-traditional students that never step foot on campus, saving the college facility costs and do not benefit directly from the extra spending. It is a combination of students asking for more services and institutions vying for a mix of students. I agree with Boehner and McEwen that overspending is responsible for the college cost crisis because when institutions are not rewarded for sound economic standing, they have no incentive to provide an innovative educational experience that would uphold them to higher standards on doing more with less money. Okay, so now, right, we're gonna talk about the parts you folks found most persuasive and least persuasive, and we'll kind of look at what we can do that information and what we can do with that information and how that can help us to revise. So let's start with the parts that you folks found most persuasive. What sentences were you folks kind of like nodding your head and like, I totally agree with this, what this guy is saying? Okay, so Eli has 1, 3, 6, and 9. Derek's got 3 and 9. Okay. So I'm guessing maybe we can relate to number 1. We are. Do you guys want to say why? What you find persuasive about these different ones? 3 and 9 use evidence from outside sources. Yeah, I had kind of the same response to number 3. Like I was like, yes, I agree with that. Okay, and then Kim, they seem factual versus opinion. Are those the same ones? Number 3? Okay, and I see a lot of us like 9 as well. Okay, awesome. Okay. Okay, so let's jump to the other question. So what were the sentences that we found less persuasive? And if we can put in the number and what, you know, what would make it more persuasive? Like, is it that we need to bring in a source? Is it that the wording needs to be changed? You know, what kind of improvement for so not necessarily for number 1, for whichever sentences you found not persuasive that you were like, that doesn't. Okay, good. Okay, so Derek has that the first using I makes it sound subjective. Does your guys' screens look funny? Is it only mine? Okay, my screen looks funny, but I guess it's only me, so I'm glad you guys can still see. Okay, so Nohelani felt number 7 with the source was helpful. Oh, number 7 needs a source. Okay, sorry. I was distracted by my screen being messed up. Let me try and flip back and forth and see if it, oh, it's just my screen. Okay, so 7, we wanted a source. Okay. 3, 7, and 8, we wanted examples. Okay, awesome. 2 and 4 questioning, 7, 8 seems vague, so we're looking for more specifics. Okay, so I think we can all see how we can use this to revise, right? We can look for sources, we can put in examples, we can include specifics, and we can eliminate our first person. Okay, that's fabulous. So I hope you folks, that's something you folks can use with your own drafts as well to kind of strengthen your writing. Okay. Again, this is from Bruce Ballinger. He's like one of my favorite writing teachers. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple more revision strategies, and then we'll move to the editing chunk. So, so just knowing that introductions are a really important piece of our writing. One option could be to try writing different introductions. You can, if you're kind of not sure where to start with that, you can do a search for different ways to start to write introductions. Again, that's something like that a tutor could help with as well. Along those same lines, you could also kind of focus on 3 key sentences. So along the same lines of knowing that our introduction is a really important paragraph, some key sentences in our thesis and our final sentence, right? So we want to make sure we have a strong first sentence that gets our readers' attention. We want to make sure our thesis is really clear and kind of perfect. That's one of the most important sentences in our paper. And then our last sentence, we want to make sure is really strong as far as the message that we're leaving our readers with. Okay. And let's jump to editing. Okay, so with editing, we're doing more smaller scale and more during the final stages of the writing process. So some of the concerns that you might think about with editing, right, is passive voice and active voice, looking at whether your tone is appropriate for your audience. So I think most often with that, it has to do with if our tone is too casual or too formal. You might look at if you're using too many words. I think a lot of us get into bad habits. We try to put in extra words because we are trying to make our instructors' length requirements, but we should remember that readers don't want to read words they don't have to. So at a certain point, it becomes valuable to try to write concisely, right? To cut out any unnecessary words. And then you might look at if you're using gendered language appropriately. So, are we using male pronouns to mean everyone? If we're doing that, we might think about what are some other options there. And part of editing is also proofreading, right? So proofreading, we might look at spelling errors, punctuation, words that have a similar sound but different meanings, such as there, and there, quotation marks, apostrophes, and formatting. And so, these, when we're looking at our editing and proofreading, these are a lot of things, a lot of this, this can take a lot of time to kind of check all of these things. I think it's really helpful if you know that you which ones of these you tend to have challenges with, then you can kind of focus on those, when you're doing your editing and your proofreading.
So an aspect of editing is proofreading, as Robin mentioned, and I did want to share a couple of the different online applications that are really valuable for proofreading, specifically spelling and grammar. I did see that Eli referenced Grammarly. I totally agree with Karina that I love Grammarly. It's a fantastic resource. The cool thing about Grammarly is that if you're typing out your essay on a Google Doc, Grammarly will be able to actually provide you with suggestions if you've spelt something incorrectly, or if you've used a word grammatically that seems a little strange in a sentence. So Grammarly is fabulous for writing essays in Google Chrome, Google Docs, but Grammarly doesn't quite work if you're writing your essay in a Word doc. So I wanted to introduce Hemingway Editor to you. If you folks are like me and you write a lot of your essays in a traditional standard Microsoft Word document, Hemingway is awesome for you. So pretty much Hemingway is a free app. It's called Hemingway Editor. You can Google it, comes up very easily. This is kind of exactly what it looks like. I'm actually going to jump back here. I'm just going to copy the text from our paragraph that we looked at, and I'm going to paste it in here. So you'll notice that there's a couple different things. We have some information on the right-hand side, and it's color coordinated. So it pretty much is telling us things like adverbs that we might be able to change or remove altogether. And it's also showing us instances of passive voice, but it looks like we don't have passive voice in this particular sentence. We also have phrases that might be a little bit simplified possibly, or sentences in yellow that are pretty hard to read, and then sentences highlighted in kind of this reddish color that are very hard to read. So Hemingway Editor is a really fantastic editing tool that I utilize quite often, especially before turning in a final draft to my instructor, right? So I definitely recommend it. I think it's a great for just kind of getting that extra set of eyes and helping to refine some of your writing skills. And then I'll just jump over to Grammarly real fast. Again, you need to have a Chrome browser for Grammarly to connect, but you would just simply click add to Chrome. It's free. It takes a second, and then Grammarly will actually be housed in your web browser. So whenever you're utilizing your Chrome browser, Grammarly will pop up with different suggestions. Even if you're typing out an email to someone and you're using a word that's incorrect, Grammarly will let you know. So it's a pretty cool proofreading tool. I definitely recommend Hemingway Editor and also Grammarly for Chrome. Okay, so I hope that those are helpful, and we'll move back to Robin, and she'll share a little bit more on kind of that editing process.
Okay, I think we're actually having you folks reflect on your process now. So since we've talked about revision and editing quite a bit, we thought it would be helpful for you folks to kind of think about what you usually do, and for us to kind of learn from you folks as well. So okay, so when you do a major writing assignment, how much time do you typically spend proofreading? And so if you remember, proofreading is kind of your last few read-throughs where you're catching those a lot of typos and that sort of thing. And how about now let's look a little bit more broadly at editing, right? So editing is where we're looking at more sentence level changes, punctuation, wording, capitalization, our spelling, homonyms, formatting. You can see we have a lot of variation, and I guess it depends, right? If we're like completely focused on this one task for a set of time, or if we're kind of jumping around to different tasks. Okay, great. How about revision? So if we think about when we might be adding new sources, moving paragraphs around, trying out different intros or conclusions. So I do want to encourage you folks. I know that a lot of the revision activities are really scary, but I do want to encourage you folks to try some of them out. And okay, so what kinds of revision strategies, what types of revision strategies do you folks usually use? So and don't worry, there's no wrong answers, I think. So whether it's you know, working with a hard copy, working with a friend, working with a tutor, looking for new sources, or some of the different things that we talked about. Okay, I'm glad to hear that Eli prints out hard copy. I know it costs money, and I know it uses paper, but I do think it's very valuable. Okay, and then which new revision strategy would you like to try? So this could be one of the things we mentioned. It could be one of the things that you learned from one of our other participants. So the ones we mentioned were the cutting up the draft, reverse outlining, believing and doubting game, focusing on your intro, or focusing on those 3 key sentences, the first, the last, and the thesis. Okay, great. If you folks, yeah, I definitely recommend looking for some other examples of reverse outlines on Google if you feel that would be helpful, or you can come in and work with us as well. We can ask the tutors if they know it, and if not, then I guess you have to work with me or Natalie. Okay, I think, did I have one more question? Or maybe I don't. Oh, I do. Okay, what types of editing or proofreading issues do you typically have? So just as a way to, you know, we talked about, you know, focusing on those grammar or punctuation issues that you know you tend to have trouble with. So are there ones you know you have trouble with, whether if it's spelling or run-ons or capitalization? I guess someone mentioned references already, so that would be one. Are there other editing or proofreading issues that you know you have?
I want to give all of you guys a huge mahalo for completing our Research and Writing RaW skills series. I know that quite a few of you have been with us from the beginning, so mahalo to all of you. We really hope that this series has been valuable, and we hope that you've been able to take some things away from this series. And you guys are